There are certain people who move through the world with a quiet ache tucked behind their ribs. You rarely notice it, they rarely admit it, but it shapes everything. The way they speak, the way they apologize, the way they shrink themselves when someone looks a little too closely. They are the ones who've learned to smile with precision, to sit straight, to stay useful. Because somewhere in their story, they were taught that worth is not something you carry, it is something you earn. So they keep earning, they keep trying, and no matter how much they accomplish, a soft shadow follows them. A whisper that says, almost, but not quite. This is the unseen life of those who never feel good enough. There is a particular kind of person who learns very early to move through life with a carefully crafted version of themselves. A version that looks capable, stable, pleasant. A version that rarely stumbles in public, even when privately they are struggling to hold their own weight. They don't call it a mask, because to them it does not feel like pretending. It feels like survival. It feels like the only way to stay acceptable in a world where acceptance never felt guaranteed. People around them often see calmness. They see someone who rarely complains, who always knows what to do, who never reacts too much or too loudly. But beneath that practiced steadiness lives a quiet fear of being truly seen. Because being seen means being evaluated, and being evaluated means the possibility of being found lacking. So their life becomes a careful choreography of appearing fine, while never risking enough truth to be rejected for it. They become experts in self-containment. They answer questions with softness. They give explanations that are shorter than their pain. And when something hurts them deeply, they respond with silence first, then a small smile, and then a reassuring sentence meant more for the other person's comfort than their own. If you listen closely, you can hear the hesitation beneath their warmth, the pause before they admit something honest, the guardedness behind their polite tone. It is the subtle language of someone who has been trained by life to stay small enough to avoid disappointment. Their days are filled with invisible calculations. Did I do enough? Did I say too much? Did I take up too much space? Did I appear needy? Did I appear distant? Did they notice the fatigue in my voice? Did I ruin something without realizing it? This mental background noise becomes the soundtrack of their existence. Quiet but constant, soft but exhausting, and yet, to the outside world, they rarely appear insecure. They rarely look fragile. That is the paradox of this inner wound. The people who feel the deepest sense of inadequacy are often the same ones who appear the most competent. Their mask is built from duty, politeness, overthinking, and years of learning how to minimize themselves so others would stay comfortable around them. Their compliments sound humble. Their apologies sound practiced. Their gratitude sounds undeserving. Even in moments where they succeed, where they shine in ways others praise, they rarely let themselves feel the fullness of it. The mind translates every achievement into an exception, never a reflection of who they truly are. And when someone tells them, "You're doing great," they smile, but their body doesn't register those words as belonging to them. Praise slides off like rain on glass. For a moment they want to believe it. Then the old voice returns, whispering quietly, "You just fooled them. It won't last." This is how the mask tightens. Not with force, but with habit. Not with lies, but with fear. People assume they're strong because they endure. People assume they're confident because they deliver. People assume they're unaffected because they don't break in public. But the truth is far softer, far lonelier. They aren't trying to impress anyone. They are simply trying not to disappoint anyone. Every day becomes a balancing act, choosing which parts of themselves are safe to reveal and which parts must remain unseen to preserve the fragile illusion of being enough. And somewhere along this journey, they forget that the mask was meant to be temporary. They forget who they were before the constant self-monitoring. They forget the natural softness they once carried inside. In quiet moments, late at night, or early in the morning before the world wakes, there is often a flicker of awareness, a small realization that the mask they wear has begun to feel like a second skin, that beneath all the calmness and competence lies a person who has never actually felt allowed to simply exist without performing for affection. This chapter is where the story begins, with the person everyone admires and the fear that lives quietly underneath their smile. Long before a person grows into the quiet adult who doubts their worth, there is a child who learned to measure themselves in small, uncertain ways. A child who did not wake up one day deciding to be afraid of not being enough, but who absorbed this fear slowly, almost innocently, through the atmosphere they lived in. No one intends to shape a child into someone who questions their right to exist comfortably, but it happens, sometimes loudly, sometimes silently, often without anyone noticing. Some children grow up in homes where affection feels conditional, where approval appears in flashes, earned through achievement, obedience, or emotional stability, where mistakes echo louder than accomplishments, where the emotional climate teaches them that love arrives not as a warm presence, but as a reward. They learn early that being good means being quiet, being helpful, being impressive, being agreeable, not needing too much, not interrupting, not taking up space that might inconvenience someone else. And a child, with their soft heart and wide eyes, interprets these patterns literally. They do not see adults as flawed human beings wrestling with their own histories. They see them as the architects of truth. If love seems available only when they perform, the child concludes there must be something unlovable about their natural self, something that must be fixed or hidden or polished into something better. So they begin shaping themselves. They choose roles without realizing they are choosing. Some become the achievers, chasing worth through perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect results. Some become the peacekeepers, absorbing tension, smoothing conflict, keeping everything calm, even at the cost of their own needs. Some become the fixers, working tirelessly to earn affection through usefulness. And others become invisible, shrinking their presence to avoid disappointing the people they love. Every one of these children shares a common belief, though they may not have the words for it. If I do more, they will love me better. It is a quiet misunderstanding, but a powerful one, because the child does not realize that adults' limited affection is not caused by their inadequacy, but by the adult's own unrepaired wounds. Sometimes the roots are even softer, almost invisible. Not neglect, not cruelty, just emotional silence. Parents who cared but did not know how to express it. Parents who were physically present but emotionally distant. Parents who provided safety but not recognition. In those homes, children learn a subtler lesson, that being themselves is simply not interesting enough to draw emotional warmth. They carry that silence into adulthood. They carry that emptiness into relationships. They carry that belief into every interaction where they quietly wonder, is there something wrong with me for wanting to be seen? For some, the echo comes from comparison. The sibling who outshined them. The cousin who was praised more. The friend who received attention they didn't know how to ask for. Children don't understand the complexity of favoritism. They only understand that someone else was chosen, and they were not. These early experiences carve grooves inside the developing mind, patterns so familiar that the adult later mistakes them for a personality. But the never enough feeling is not personality. It is inheritance. It is adaptation. It is a survival strategy learned too young from people who themselves never learned how to feel enough. Even now, Years later, the adult may not remember the exact moments that shaped them, but their body remembers, their nervous system remembers. Their emotional reactions are filled with ghosts of old atmospheres, rooms where they felt too loud, too slow, too sensitive, too demanding, too disappointing. This chapter closes with a simple truth. A person's lifelong feeling of inadequacy is rarely born from weakness. It is born from a childhood where love felt like something to earn, not something to belong to. By the time someone reaches adulthood with a lifelong sense of inadequacy, the belief has already woven itself into the deeper architecture of their mind. It no longer feels like a conclusion formed in childhood. It feels like truth. A quiet, unquestioned truth that sits beneath every decision, every reaction, every attempt to grow. Psychology has words for these patterns, yet the lived experience of them is far more tender and human than textbooks can ever capture. One of the most pervasive patterns is maladaptive perfectionism, the belief that anything less than flawless is failure. It does not feel like ambition. It feels like safety. The mind convinces the person that being perfect is the only way to avoid rejection, embarrassment, or disappointment. So they push themselves into impossible standards, not because they crave excellence, but because they fear the consequences of being ordinary. Then there is rejection sensitivity, a heightened alertness to any sign of disapproval, however small or imagined. A neutral tone becomes a warning. A delayed message becomes a threat. The nervous system reacts as if emotional danger is everywhere, interpreting quiet moments as evidence of being unloved, unseen, or forgotten. This is not dramatization. It is the brain protecting an old wound. Attachment theory adds another layer. Children who grow up with inconsistent warmth often develop what psychologists call anxious attachment, a constant scanning for cues of acceptance. Those with emotional neglect may grow into adults with avoidant attachment, hiding needs, rejecting intimacy, convincing themselves they prefer emotional distance because distance feels safer than potential disappointment. And some tragically hold both patterns at once, craving closeness but fearing exposure, wanting affection but mistrusting it. The science is clear. A person who never feels good enough is not irrational. They are responding to the emotional blueprint their mind built for survival. Even the brain's threat detection system plays a role. When a child learns that rejection or criticism hurts more deeply than it should, the amygdala, responsible for detecting danger, begins operating in a heightened state. In adulthood, this can look like overthinking, self-monitoring, or assuming the worst. Not because the person is weak, but because their brain was shaped by environments where emotional safety was unpredictable. Then there is comparison, the silent poison of modern life. Social dynamics, achievements, appearance, relationships, all become arenas where the person evaluates themselves harshly. But comparison is rarely about others. It is about filling an internal void with external evidence that might finally prove worth. Yet no amount of evidence ever feels conclusive. Every compliment is temporary. Every achievement fades. Every moment of recognition dissolves before it can be absorbed. Cognitive psychology calls this negative self-schema, a deeply rooted mental framework that filters reality through self-doubt. To the person trapped inside it, life becomes a constant negotiation. Did I do too much? Did I do too little? Did I make them uncomfortable? Did I disappoint them? Should I have stayed quiet? Should I have been more present? Should I have been someone else entirely? Another phenomenon appears too, emotional minimization. People who never feel good enough often downplay their own needs, dismiss their accomplishments, and silence their pain. They internalize a belief that their emotions are burdensome, their desires excessive, their struggles insignificant. So they pretend, they numb, They stay functional even when they're exhausted, because functioning feels like the only acceptable form of existence. And woven beneath all of this is a simple psychological truth. The human mind will hold on to any belief that once helped it survive, even if that belief hurts in adulthood. The never enough feeling is not a flaw. It is a learned response, a memory of environments where love was uncertain, expectations were heavy, or self-worth was never reflected back with tenderness. In understanding these patterns, something shifts, not as advice or correction, but as recognition. Because acknowledging the psychology behind this pain does not cure it, but it does make it less lonely. Inside every person who never feels good enough, there are two selves quietly fighting for control. One is tired, exhausted from years of trying to measure up, longing for rest, craving softness, wanting to be held without having to earn the right to be held. The other is relentless, demanding improvement, rejecting comfort, insisting that survival depends on constant effort. This inner conflict is not loud. It doesn't erupt. It hums beneath the surface, shaping every reaction, every hesitation, every moment where the heart feels heavy for reasons that are difficult to explain. The tired self whispers, "You have done enough." The relentless self replies, "Not yet." And so the war continues. This is not a dramatic battle. It is subtle, invisible. It shows itself in quiet moments, when they want to rest but feel guilty, when they want to say no but feel unworthy of boundaries, when they crave closeness but fear the scrutiny that comes with being truly known. The inner war turns even simple desires into complicated emotional negotiations. On one side is vulnerability, the desire to be understood, the longing to be seen without performing, the hope that someone might meet the unpolished parts with warmth instead of judgment. This side is soft, human, honest. It wants connection. On the other side is defense, the instinct to self-protect, the urge to stay perfect enough that no one will look too closely, the belief that if they keep their true feelings hidden, they will remain safe from disappointment. This side is rigid, practiced, deeply conditioned. It fears connection. Together, these two selves create a life where people are kept at a distance, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Fear that closeness will reveal inadequacy. Fear that honesty will push someone away. Fear that love, once gained, could be lost for reasons they never see coming. This is why they struggle receiving praise. A compliment feels like a spotlight they haven't earned. Affection feels like a responsibility they must maintain. Opportunities feel like traps where any misstep will expose the truth they privately believe, that they are not truly enough. Even in relationships, the war persists. They want intimacy but fear being a burden. They want reassurance but worry they're asking for too much. They want stability but expect abandonment. They pull people close, then push them away, then feel guilty for both impulses. It is not manipulation. It is the echo of old emotional patterns that still believe love is conditional. The war also shows up as self-sabotage. When something good enters their life, they might hesitate, overthink, or withdraw, not because they don't want it, but because good things feel temporary, because joy feels suspicious, because part of them believes they must damage something before life takes it away, a way of staying in control of the loss. There is also the battle between expression and silence. They often know what they feel, but the words get stuck before reaching the surface, not because they lack emotional language, but because their mind whispers, "Your feelings are too heavy. Keep them to yourself." So they stay quiet, even when they're hurting, even when they need someone, even when love stands right in front of them, willing to hold the truth with kindness. This chapter is the heart of the struggle, the war between who they are and who they think they must be. a war between a soul that wants to rest and a mind that refuses to let it. And the tragedy is not that they fight this battle. The tragedy is that they fight it alone. But even in this quiet battle, there is a small, fragile truth waiting to be acknowledged, a truth that will shift the story in the next chapter. No one can win a war within themselves forever. There comes a point in every life where the inner conflict, the self-monitoring, the constant striving simply becomes too heavy to carry. This moment rarely arrives with drama. It does not always look like breakdowns or loud confessions. Sometimes it comes quietly, an evening where their chest feels too tight, a familiar task suddenly feels impossible, or a moment of stillness exposes an exhaustion that has been accumulating for years. This moment is not collapse, it is clarity, painful, undeniable clarity. A recognition that something inside has been stretching too thin for too long. For some people, the cracking moment happens in the middle of success. They finish a big milestone, receive praise, reach a long-awaited goal. And instead of feeling joy, they feel nothing, just numbness, emptiness, a strange emotional distance from the life they've worked so hard to build. It is in this emptiness that they realize the truth. Achievement cannot quiet a wound that was never created by failure. For others, the cracking moment appears through burnout. Their body begins to say what their mouth has been trained not to. Fatigue becomes a constant companion. Concentration slips. Tasks feel heavier than they logically should. And suddenly, even getting out of bed requires negotiation. Their exhaustion is not laziness. It is the body finally refusing to fuel a lifelong performance of adequacy. Sometimes the moment happens in relationships. A partner says, "I feel like you don't let me in." A friend says, "You always act strong. Don't you get tired?" A child asks, "Why do you look sad?" These small questions pierce through the mask, not because they are critical, but because they reveal something frightening. People have sensed their struggle, even when they believe they hid it perfectly. And then there are the private moments, the ones no one sees. Sitting in the car a little longer before driving home, staring at the ceiling late at night with a heaviness that words cannot articulate. Feeling tears rise for reasons that feel too vague to explain. This quiet unraveling is not weakness. It is the soul pushing against the pressure of a self-image held together for too long. In this cracking, a person begins to sense the cost of their lifelong belief. They notice how tired they are from proving things no one asked them to prove. They realize how much of themselves they've muted, softened, or erased just to feel acceptable. They see how often they laugh when uncomfortable, apologize when unnecessary, stay calm when hurt. And a question begins to form, gentle but devastating. Why do I feel like I'm never allowed to be fully human? This moment is disorienting because the belief I must be better to be loved has become so ingrained that imagining life without it feels impossible, almost dangerous. Yet something inside them aches for change, a small trembling desire for softness, rest, and a life where their existence doesn't feel like a test. The cracking is not destruction. It is truth demanding space. It is the self, long buried under expectations and fear, finally whispering loud enough to be heard. It does not ask for transformation. It only asks to be acknowledged. And once this moment happens, once a person becomes aware of the cost of their inner war, something irreversible begins. They cannot return to pretending they feel nothing. They cannot unsee the weight they carry. They cannot go back to believing that self-worth must be earned in exhausting ways. The cracking moment is the first shift, not toward healing yet, but toward honesty. It is the point where silence becomes heavier than truth, where perfection becomes lonelier than vulnerability, and where the self begins, quietly, tenderly, to ask for its own return. When the cracking moment softens into awareness, something very quiet begins to happen inside a person. There is no dramatic awakening, no sudden transformation. Instead, there is a slow, gentle opening, like a door that has been shut for years, shifting slightly under its own weight. And behind that door is someone they have not looked at in a long time, the younger version of themselves, still waiting to be acknowledged. People often imagine healing as something external, new habits, better decisions, changed behavior. But emotional wounds are not corrected by strategy. They are softened by recognition. And the recognition begins when the adult finally looks inward and finds a child who once learned to survive by shrinking. This inner child is not a metaphor. It is a memory that still breathes. A younger self frozen in the moment they first learned to doubt their worth. This child may appear timid, cautious, overly responsible, or endlessly apologetic. They may look like someone who tried too hard to keep the peace, someone who carried burdens they never should have carried, someone who mistook silence for safety because emotional noise felt dangerous. And when the adult meets them again, even in imagination, something unexpected happens. A wave of tenderness rises, because suddenly the harsh inner critic, the one that has pushed them for years, begins to sound less like personal truth and more like an echo of what that child once needed to believe to feel protected. When they look at this child, really look, they begin to understand why they feel the way they do, why they flinch at disappointment, why they fear criticism, why they downplay joy, why they mistrust kindness, why they feel undeserving of rest, softness, or affection. It all leads back to a younger self who was simply trying to make sense of the world with limited tools. This chapter is not about forgiveness, because forgiveness implies wrongdoing. The child did nothing wrong. It is about recognition. And recognition is a form of emotional permission. For the first time, the adult sees that their sense of inadequacy wasn't born from failure. It was inherited from environments that didn't know how to reflect worth. They didn't become this way because they were weak. They became this way because they were adaptive. And in this recognition, something shifts. The inner child is no longer the silent force shaping their behaviors. They become someone to protect, someone to comfort, someone to understand. In this emotional meeting, gentleness emerges like a new language. The adult learns to pause when the old voice whispers, "Not enough." Not to argue with it, but to ask softly, "Where did you learn that?" The moment they begin asking, not with judgment, but with curiosity, the entire emotional landscape begins to loosen. They realize the voice was never theirs. It belonged to a child who thought perfection was the only way to avoid loss. A child who believed their natural self was too fragile to be accepted. A child who thought inadequacy was a flaw, when, in truth, it was a misunderstanding. Healing does not happen instantly. There is no dramatic closure. The person still feels fear, still hesitates, still hears the old echoes. But something fundamental changes. The shame begins to separate from the self. They start noticing moments where their body tenses unnecessarily, moments where they apologize reflexively, moments where they withhold needs because asking feels unsafe. These moments become signals, not of failure, but of history, and little by little, the relationship with the self softens, not into confidence, not into certainty, but into permission, the permission to be imperfect, emotional, human. The adult begins offering the younger self what they didn't receive: patience instead of pressure, presence instead of performance, warmth instead of evaluation. Meeting the inner child again is not the end of the journey, but it is the moment a person stops running from themselves and begins walking toward the parts they lost along the way. There is a moment, often small, often quiet, where a person who has spent their life feeling not enough begins to sense that something inside them has changed. Not healed fully, not resolved, not transformed into certainty, but softened. The edges that once felt sharp now feel a little rounder. The inner critic still speaks, but its voice is less commanding. The fear still rises, but it no longer swallows the entire world. Something gentle has entered the spaces where only pressure once lived. This softness is not confidence. It is not pride. It is not even self-love. It is simply the absence of eternal self-punishment, a subtle permission to exist without constant justification. People often imagine closure as a clean ending, a moment where the past untangles from the present and the person emerges new. But real closure is different. It feels like a quiet understanding that life will always carry traces of old stories, and healing is not the erasure of those stories, but the ability to walk forward without being governed by them. For the person who never felt good enough, this soft ending arrives as a realization. They are allowed to be human. They are allowed to rest without earning it, allowed to speak without rehearsing, allowed to feel without apologizing, allowed to be imperfect without collapsing into shame. This is not a transformation others will notice. It is not dramatic enough to appear in expressions or gestures. It happens internally, in moments as small as waking up and not immediately evaluating themselves, or taking a breath without feeling the weight of expectations, or hearing a compliment and letting a tiny part of it land instead of slipping away. They begin understanding that worth is not something they chase. It is something that exists quietly within them, unperforming, unpolished, unchanged by mistakes or moods or memories. Worth that was always there, but hidden beneath layers of fear, history, and old emotional agreements. The world, of course, does not change around them. People still misunderstand them at times. Life still offers moments of disappointment. Their past still echoes occasionally, but their relationship with themselves slowly shifts. And that shift is everything. Because now, when the old voice whispers, "Not enough," a newer voice rises, not louder, not stronger, but steadier. A voice shaped from understanding rather than fear. A voice that says, "You do not need to earn the right to exist." A voice that knows inadequacy was never truth, only memory. Soft endings often come with grief too. Grief for the years spent believing their worth was fragile. Grief for the child who carried too much. Grief for the relationships where they gave everything and still felt undeserving. Grief for the version of themselves who tried so hard, so quietly, to be enough for a world that never explained what enough even meant. But grief, in this context, is a form of love. A love extended backward in time to every version of themselves that didn't receive it. A love that finally replaces survival with gentleness. And so the ending is not triumphant. It is human. It is someone learning to breathe without apology. Someone discovering they do not need to impress anyone to be safe. Someone realizing that being good enough was never something to reach, only something to recognize. Life doesn't become easier, but it becomes softer. And in that softness, they finally begin to meet themselves. Not the mask, not the performance, not the frightened child, but the quiet, enduring self that remained beneath it all. The story ends with that softness, carrying them forward toward a life where their worth is no longer a question to answer, but a truth that gently stays.